A surge in work-related deaths is forcing Japan to take a hard look at its office culture.
CBS News Radio's Lucy Kraft has more from Tokyo.
Years after losing his son, Itsuo Sekigawa is still in shock, grief-stricken and angry. Straight out of college in 2009, his son Satoshi proudly joined a prestigious manufacturer. But within a year, he was dead. Investigators said the stress of working extreme hours drove him to take his own life. The young engineer fell victim to the Japanese phenomenon of Karoshi, or death from overwork. An early day for him was going home at 9 p.m., his father says. If work wasn't finished, he'd stay until midnight. Young women are just as vulnerable. This month, state broadcaster NHK revealed one of its reporters, 31-year-old Miwa Sato, had died from heart failure after working near 14-hour days. It took 4 years for NHK to announce Sato's death. Her parents accused the network of a cover-up.
The reality is that in Japan, workers are working ridiculous hours. I think that's hard to deny.
American labor activist Louis Carlett says such sacrifice is seen as a virtue here.
There's a strong cultural norm that you have to devote everything to the company, and you're a corporate warrior, and I think that's what really pushes people over the edge.
Karoshi hits everyone from doctors and truck drivers to computer programmers and construction workers in Japan. Grieving father Sekigawa says while Americans work overtime to get ahead, Japanese work extreme overtime because they are forced to. Last year, just under 2,000 Japanese committed suicide for reasons linked to their jobs, a number that has remained stubbornly high for 2 decades. Families of Karoshi victims say the government's proposal to cap overtime at 100 hours a month and exempt many professions won't stop people from working themselves to death. There is no job worth a human life, said Sekigawa. But if our politicians pass laws that really hurt companies, they'd lose elections. So I'm afraid the situation is insoluble. Lucy Kraft, CBS News, Tokyo.
I was reading that this
Karoshi,
that it started after World War II, and it was encouraged because they had to rebuild their economy,
right.
And so this industrious behavior, industrious nature was something that worked for them.
It's, Japan is, as many people know, my favorite country after France. I've lived there. It's a wonderful place, but that is part of the culture. It's not necessarily a boss that tells you you have to stay and work overtime.
Right.
That country went from being essentially an agrarian society in 1850 to modernizing to the point where they were able to attack the United States less than 100 years later.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just part of the Japanese culture, which is this idea of working really, really hard. They probably will need to have laws passed to ensure that people are not forced to do it,
right,
or at least feel obligated to do it.
But I imagine bosses are working as hard as well,
Absolutely.
Right?
Everybody.
Right.
Everybody in Japan, whether you are the CEO or you're, delivering mail, is working, believes that work is part of what you're supposed to do.
All right, well, the father in that piece said it, no job is worth your life, right? A little perspective.